Hey everyone, welcome to East Park. Today I want to argue that South Park is not just a cartoon, it is the most accurate political document of the last 30 years. Not a news channel, not a political podcast, not an academic paper, a cartoon about 4 kids in a small Colorado town that has consistently described where American politics was going before it got there. From a school mascot election in 2004 that gave America a phrase it still uses today, to a White House that felt the need to officially respond to an animated episode in 2025, South Park has been drawing the map of this country's political future and did episode at a time, usually years before anyone else was willing to say the same thing out loud. We are going to go through all of it. The wall, the talking fruit that decoded Make America Great Again, the tweet a fictional president posted on a Wednesday that the real one matched on Friday, the 1999 song that waited 26 years to stop being a joke, and the official White House statement that called a cartoon irrelevant while proving the exact opposite by existing at all. South Park did not get lucky. There is a specific method behind all of it, and by the end of this video, you are going to see exactly what that method is. But before we begin, I would just like to kindly ask you to subscribe. It is completely free and it really does help us keep making videos for this community we have been building together. Alright, that is enough of that. Let us get into it. The wall that started it all. There is a moment that happens every few years where someone goes back and watches an old South Park episode and just stops. They pause it, they stare at the screen, and then they go online and start telling everyone they know what they just saw. That happened a lot in 2016, and it happened even more in 2025. Because there is one episode of South Park that sits above almost everything else the show has ever done when it comes to predicting American politics. It aired on September 23rd, 2015. It was the second episode of season 19. And when you watch it today, it does not feel like a cartoon from 10 years ago. It feels like someone filmed a news report, animated it, and then buried it in the past for people to find later. The episode is called Where My Country Gone, and almost everything in it came true. To understand why this episode matters so much, you have to understand what was happening in America in the summer of 2015. Donald Trump had announced his presidential campaign on June 16th, 2015. He came down an escalator in Trump Tower in New York City and gave a speech that shocked a lot of people. He talked about immigrants crossing the southern border. He called them criminals. He promised to build a wall between the United States and Mexico and make Mexico pay for it. Almost every political expert on television laughed it off. The general feeling was that his campaign was a joke and would be over within a few months. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the 2 men who create South Park, were watching all of this, and they do something that most television writers do not do. They write each episode of South Park in about 6 days before it airs. That means they are always working with whatever is happening in the news that exact week. They cannot plan too far ahead. They just have to look at what is going on, find the most absurd and honest version of it, and put it on screen. So 3 months after Trump announced his campaign, they wrote Where My Country Gone. The episode opens with South Park being overrun by Canadian immigrants. They are everywhere. They are in the classrooms. They are in the streets. And one character in particular cannot stand it. That character is Mr. Garrison. Mr. Garrison is a teacher at South Park Elementary who has been on the show since the very beginning. In this episode, he snaps. He cannot handle all the Canadian immigrants flooding into his town, and he starts making speeches about it. He stands up in front of crowds. He complains about the immigrants playing their music, speaking differently, and changing the town. He is loud. He is angry. He does not offer any real solutions. He just says outrageous things that people somehow respond to anyway. He also wears a white baseball cap. The cap says, "Where My Country Gone" on it. It is an almost exact copy of Donald Trump's red Make America Great Again hat, just in white with different words. The show was not being subtle. This was a direct, clear parody of Trump's presidential campaign, built in real time as the campaign was actually happening. But then Garrison starts talking about what he wants to do about the immigrant problem. And this is where the episode goes from being a funny parody to being something genuinely strange to watch in hindsight. Garrison tells CNN in the episode that he wants to build a big wall. He wants to build a wall between the United States and Canada to stop the immigrants from coming over. He announces this to a crowd. The crowd cheers. He keeps making his speeches. The town gets behind him, and Garrison becomes a political force almost overnight, running entirely on anger and the promise of a wall. Sound familiar? Now here is where the episode gets even more interesting. Garrison decides to go to Canada himself. He sneaks across the border by getting into a wooden barrel and going over Niagara Falls, which is the kind of thing thing only South Park would think of. When he gets to Canada, he expects to find a country full of people just freely walking around. Instead, he finds something completely unexpected. Canada has already built a wall, a massive wall sitting right on the Canadian side of the border, built by Canadians to keep Americans out. A Canadian border guard explains it plainly. The wall exists to stop Americans from getting in and messing with Canada's cool stuff. Canada built the wall themselves. They did not wait for anyone to build it for them. They just looked at what was coming and decided to protect themselves first. In 2015, that detail was funny, just an absurd little joke inside a cartoon. In 2025, when Trump started imposing major tariffs on Canada and threatening to make Canada the 51st state of the United States, Canada did not build a literal wall, but they did something economically similar. Canada responded with billions of dollars in retaliatory tariffs, essentially putting up financial barriers between themselves and the US. Online, people immediately started pointing back to this episode. There were posts everywhere saying that South Park had already drawn this exact picture 10 years earlier, America getting aggressive toward Canada, and Canada firing back to protect itself. Colorado's Governor Gerald even posted publicly about it in March 2025, referencing South Park and the character Ike Broflovsky, who is a Canadian-born character on the show. He was using a cartoon from 2015 to make a serious political point about real trade policy happening in real time. A cartoon had described the situation better than most news articles were doing. But the most important moment in the entire episode is not the wall, it is a dinner scene. Butters, one of the South Park kids, has been spending time with a Canadian girl named Charlotte. He really likes her. He has dinner with her family, and at that dinner table, Charlotte's father explains why they left Canada. He explains what happened back home. He tells Butters about the election in Canada that caused everything to fall apart. He says that during the last Canadian election, there was a candidate, a brash man, who just said whatever he wanted. He did not offer solutions to anything. He just said outrageous things, one after another. At first, everyone thought it was funny. Nobody took him seriously. The people who voted for him did it almost as a joke because they thought it would be entertaining, because they thought there was no way someone like that could actually end up running the country. But the joke went on too long, and before anyone realized what was happening, he was being sworn in as president. Charlotte's father says, almost word for word, nobody really thought he'd ever be president. It was a joke. But we just let the joke go on for too long. That line aired on September 23rd, 2015. On November 9th, 2016, more than a year later, that is exactly what people were saying about Donald Trump's actual election victory, not a fictional version of it. The real thing. People who had voted for Trump as a protest, people who had laughed at his rallies thinking it was entertaining, political analysts who had dismissed him for over a year. All of them on the morning after the 2016 election were essentially repeating the same sentence that a fictional Canadian cartoon father had said in a South Park episode 14 months earlier. Nobody really thought he'd win. It was a joke. And the joke went on too long. There is also the matter of the Canadian president himself. When Garrison finally finds his way into Canada and tracks down whoever is running the country, he comes face to face with a character who is a direct cartoon version of Donald Trump. Orange-tinted skin, wild hair, a big personality. He is completely over the top. He is reckless, and he has turned Canada into a wreck. The citizens of Canada, under his rule, have fled. The country looks destroyed. Buildings are empty. Streets are abandoned. The people who stayed describe living there as unbearable. The show was making a specific point with this. It was not just mocking Trump's appearance or personality. It was asking a genuine question. What happens to a country if someone like this actually wins? What does it look like on the other side of that? The Canadian president in the episode is not just a funny caricature. He is the endpoint of a political pattern. He is what happens when the joke goes too far. Parker and Stone put this episode out when Trump was still in the early months of his first campaign, and most people on television were still laughing at the idea of him winning anything. South Park was already past that conversation. They had already drawn the map of where this was going. One more detail that is worth pointing out. At the end of the episode, Garrison decides to take his campaign further. He is not just going to stay in South Park. He is going to run for president of the United States. He announces his candidacy. His running mate is Caitlyn Jenner, and the two of them drive off toward Washington in a car, with Jenner at the wheel, immediately running someone over. Parker and Stone have explained that they made this choice, using Garrison as a Trump stand-in rather than depicting Trump directly, because they genuinely believed Trump's campaign would be over quickly. They thought that by the time the episode aired and the seasons continued, Trump would already be out of the race. Using a fictional character meant they could continue the storyline even after Trump dropped out, without the whole thing feeling stale. They were wrong about Trump dropping out. By season 20, Garrison was running a full presidential campaign. By the end of season 20, Garrison had won, and Parker and Stone had to rewrite the final episodes of that season in real time because they had spent the entire year writing it on the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win. The episode they had originally planned for the night after the election was titled The Very First Gentleman, a reference to Bill Clinton becoming the first man to be First Lady. That episode never aired. They retitled it Oh Geez and spent the night before it aired completely rebuilding it to match a reality that had caught even them off guard. Even the people who had predicted everything had not quite predicted everything. That is what makes Where My Country Gone so striking to go back and watch now. It is not a perfect prediction. Parker and Stone never claimed to be predicting anything. They were just looking at the shape of what was already happening in 2015 and following it to where it was going. A political candidate with no real policies who said outrageous things, a growing anger about immigration and national identity, a wall. A country that starts as a joke and ends as something nobody can laugh at anymore. They drew all of it in a cartoon. They drew it 3 months into Trump's campaign, when everyone on cable news was still telling people not to worry. And then they watched the rest of the world slowly catch up to what they had already put on screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wall is just the beginning of the story though, because while Garrison was announcing his campaign and making his promises, something else was happening inside South Park that year. Something that would turn out to be an even bigger prediction than the wall, and one that almost nobody was talking about at the time. A new principal had just arrived at South Park Elementary, and his name was PC Principal. Section 2, PC Principal and the Cancel Culture Era. On September 16th, 2015, 1 week before Where My Country Gone aired, South Park introduced a character who would end up being just as important as Mr. Garrison's entire presidential campaign. His name was PC Principal, and the world he represented, the rules he enforced, the way he spoke, the things he punished people for, did not fully arrive in mainstream American life until 2 or 3 years after South Park put him on screen. That gap is what makes this prediction so interesting. With Garrison, South Park was clearly looking at something that was already happening. Trump's campaign was real. The wall was a real proposal. The crowds at the rallies were real. Parker and Stone just followed it to its conclusion. But with PC Principal, they were not following a trend that was already fully visible. They were watching something small and growing in certain corners of college campuses and the internet, and they were drawing the full-grown version of it before most people had even noticed the seed. By 2018, 2019, and especially 2020, that full-grown version had taken over. The episode that introduced PC Principal was called Stunning and Brave. It was the season 19 premiere, and it aired exactly 1 week before the Canadian Wall episode. South Park was running both stories at the same time across the season, which was something Parker and Stone had started doing, building one long connected story across an entire season rather than doing separate standalone episodes. The premise of Stunning and Brave is simple. South Park Elementary gets a new principal. His name is PC Principal, and his initials stand for politically correct. He replaces the old principal on day 1 and immediately starts reshaping everything about how the school operates. He calls an assembly. He tells the entire student body that things are going to change. And then he makes clear what those changes look like. PC Principal believes that everyone around him is offensive and needs to be corrected. He enforces what the show calls political correctness, the idea that certain words, phrases, and opinions are harmful and must be removed from everyday life. On the surface, this sounds like a reasonable enough idea. But the show is not interested in the surface version. It is interested in what happens when this idea is taken to an extreme and handed to someone who uses it as a weapon. PC Principal does not just ask people to change how they speak. He threatens them. He physically attacks them. In his very first episode, he beats Cartman nearly to death in a school bathroom for using the word spokesman instead of spokesperson. He does this to a child, a 4th grader, and he justifies it because the word Cartman used was, in his view, offensive. The show was not saying that caring about language is bad. It was asking what happens when the enforcement of that caring becomes more violent and more controlling than the thing it claims to be fighting against. And it was asking that question in 2015, years before most people were having that debate in public. PC Principal also surrounds himself with a group of followers. They form a fraternity called the PC Bro. These are college-aged white men who live together and spend most of their time loudly defending the rights of minority groups. Groups they are not part of and have not spoken to. They hold parties. They shout people down. They use language and social pressure to make anyone who disagrees with them feel like a bad person. This is the detail that ended up being most accurate. Because when cancel culture became a dominant force in American politics, roughly between 2017 and 2020, one of the most common observations people made was that the loudest voices enforcing progressive rules were often not the people those rules were meant to protect. Just like the PC Bros in South Park, a lot of the most aggressive online shamers were young, educated people from comfortable backgrounds who had taken on the language of social justice as an identity. They were not correcting genuine harm most of the time. They were performing. They were using the appearance of moral outrage to gain social status. South Park drew that exact portrait in September 2015. The show did not frame this as a left versus right argument. It was not saying that the concerns behind political correctness were wrong. It was saying that the system being built around those concerns, the enforcement, the punishment, the way it could be taken over by people who were more interested in power than in actually helping anyone, was heading somewhere dangerous. And it was heading there faster than people realized. Kyle is the character who ends up in the center of the season 19 storyline around PC Principal. Kyle is usually the voice of reason on the show. He is the kid who pushes back. He is the one who, in a lot of episodes, says the uncomfortable true thing that nobody else will say. In season 19, Kyle gets broken down. PC Principal and the PC Bros target Kyle because he refuses to say that Caitlyn Jenner is a hero. This is a reference to the real-world story of Caitlyn Jenner, who came out as a transgender woman in 2015 and was widely celebrated for it. The show, characteristically, was not mocking Jenner herself. It was mocking the way that the response to Jenner's story had been turned into a kind of loyalty test, where if you did not enthusiastically celebrate in exactly the right way, you were labeled a bad person. Kyle does not think Jenner is a hero. He thinks Jenner is a person who made a brave personal decision, but he is not going to say the word hero just because someone is demanding he say it. That position, entirely reasonable by most standards, gets him targeted by PC Principal and the fraternity. They fill his room with pigs, they shame him publicly, they chase him, and eventually, Kyle breaks. At the end of the first episode, Kyle stands up in front of the school and says that Caitlyn Jenner is brave and stunning. The crowd goes wild. The PC Bros celebrate. And Kyle looks like he has said something he does not believe under pressure because the social cost of not saying it was too high. That scene, which aired in September 2015, looked like a very familiar pattern to millions of Americans by 2019 and 2020, not just in politics, but in workplaces, on social media, in schools. The experience of being pushed to publicly agree with something, not because you genuinely believe it, but because disagreeing would cost you too much, became one of the defining social experiences of the late 2000s. People watched their coworkers do it. People felt the pressure to do it themselves. It had a name by then, cancel culture, but South Park had already built the whole machine and shown it running in 2015. There is another layer to the PC Principal storyline that took longer to fully land, but ended up being one of the sharpest things season 19 did. By the end of the season, it is revealed that PC Principal is not just a misguided idealist. He has been used. The entire wave of political correctness that swept through South Park, the gentrification, the Whole Foods that opened up, the forced social changes, was engineered by corporations and advertisers. The companies selling products needed a docile, obedient public. Political correctness in the show's framing was the tool they used to create that public. Get people focused on language and offense and social scoring, and they stop asking bigger questions. They become easier to sell to. PC Principal did not know he was a pawn. He genuinely believed in what he was doing. That was part of the point. The most effective tools in a system like this are the people who think they are fighting for something real. This part of the prediction is harder to attach to a single real-world moment, but it connects directly to a conversation that grew louder and louder across the following decade, about how corporations adopted progressive language not because they believed in it, but because it was useful to them, about how brands started taking political stances during social movements and then continued their normal business practices once the news cycle moved on, about how the language of inclusion got absorbed into marketing while the actual structures it was supposed to challenge stayed exactly the same. South Park drew that in 2015. Not as a conspiracy theory, but as satire that followed a simple logical question: who benefits when everyone is too afraid to say the wrong thing? It is also worth being specific about the timing, because timing is everything when it comes to these predictions. When PC Principle arrived in September 2015, the phrase cancel culture did not exist yet. The term started appearing in wider use around 2017 and became a major political flashpoint in 2019 and 2020. The Me Too movement, which began in 2017, brought a wave of public shamings and professional consequences for people across entertainment, media, and politics. The summer of 2020, following the death of George Floyd, brought another enormous wave of public pressure campaigns, firings, and social media callouts that went far beyond individual bad actors and swept up ordinary people, companies, sports teams, and historical statues. By 2020, cancel culture was one of the most argued about phrases in American politics. Entire careers had been ended by it. Entire careers had been built on fighting it. It had become a core part of how both political parties talked about the country. All of that, the structure of it, the way it worked, the psychology behind it, was sitting in a South Park episode from 2015, 5 years before it fully arrived. And PC Principle himself was not a one-episode joke character. He has remained a main character on the show all the way through season 27 in 2025. Parker and Stone liked him enough that they kept him around for a decade. Because the thing he represents, the tension between genuine concern for fairness and the weaponized version of that concern, did not go away. It grew. It is still growing. The other thing that made PC Principle work as a character and as a prediction was that he was not entirely wrong. This is important. The show was not saying that the things PC Principle cared about were stupid or fake. It was not dismissing the idea that language matters, or that some forms of offense cause real harm. PC Principle sometimes identified real problems. Sometimes his interventions were actually appropriate. The show gave him enough dimension that you could not write him off as a simple villain. What the show was saying is that the method, the enforcement, the punishment, the refusal to allow disagreement was broken. That a movement built on protecting people from harm was building tools that could just as easily be pointed at anyone. That the line between genuine accountability and mob pressure was being crossed more and more often, and that nobody seemed to want to talk about it honestly because talking about it honestly might get you labeled as one of the bad guys. That is a complicated idea. Most television would not go near it. South Park put it in the first episode of a season in 2015, and then spent the next 10 years watching it play out in the real world exactly the way they described. There is one more thing worth saying about what Parker and Stone were doing with season 19 as a whole. They ran the PC Principle story and the Garrison/Trump story at the same time in the same season on purpose. These were not two separate ideas. They were two sides of the same thing. On one side, you had a political movement built on anger, nativism, and the feeling that the country was being taken away from the people it belonged to. On the other side, you had an enforcement culture built on shame, social punishment, and the idea that anyone who disagreed with the approved position was a bad person. Parker and Stone were saying that these two things were feeding each other. That the more aggressive the political correctness enforcement became, the more people it pushed toward the other side. That the more extreme the other side got, the more it justified even harder enforcement, a loop, getting tighter every cycle. By 2020, that loop was the defining shape of American politics. Red versus blue, woke versus anti-woke, the two sides screaming louder and louder, and each one becoming more extreme partly because the other side existed. Parker and Stone saw that dynamic being built in 2015 and put it in cartoon form while most people were still thinking about it as two separate issues. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, but while all of this was happening in season 19, the wall, the PC principal takeover, the political campaigns, there was an older South Park episode sitting quietly in the archives that had already described the whole electoral situation more simply and more perfectly than anything else the show ever made. It came from 2004. It was about a school mascot election, and it gave American politics a phrase it has never been able to shake. Section 3, Douche versus Turd. The episode America still quotes 20 years later in 2004. South Park aired an episode about a school mascot election. That is genuinely what it was about on the surface. A school mascot, not the presidency, not a wall, not political correctness, just a group of kids in Colorado arguing over what animal or symbol should represent their elementary school. And yet that episode, more than almost anything else South Park has ever produced, ended up describing American presidential politics in a way that has only gotten more accurate with every single election since. The episode was called Douche and Turd. It aired on October 27th, 2004, 1 week before the real presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry, and the phrase it put into the world has never left. People are still using it today. They used it in 2016, they used it in 2020, they used it in 2024. Every 4 years, without fail, a large portion of the American voting public goes back to that episode and says, yes, that is exactly what this is. That kind of staying power does not happen by accident. It happens when a piece of writing captures something genuinely true about how the world works and packages it in a way that is impossible to forget. The setup of the episode is simple. A PETA group shows up at South Park Elementary and protests the use of a cow as the school mascot. They argue that using a real animal as a mascot is offensive and harmful. The school agrees to change the mascot, and they ask the students to vote for a new one. The students are not excited about any of the real options on the ballot. The choices are boring. So Kyle, as a joke, suggests that one of the mascots should be a giant douche. And Cartman, also as a joke, suggests that the other option should be a turd sandwich. The school counts the votes, and those two joke options get the most support. Now they have to hold an actual election between a giant douche and a turd sandwich. Stan looks at this situation and refuses to participate. He does not want to vote for either of them. He does not see the point. He thinks both options are equally stupid, and the whole exercise is a waste of time. His friends cannot understand his attitude. His parents get on his case about it at dinner. The whole town acts like his refusal to vote is some kind of national emergency, and then things escalate quickly. Diddy, the rapper, playing a version of himself, shows up running a campaign called Vote or Die. The premise is exactly what it sounds like. You either vote or P. Diddy and his crew kill you. Stan is now being chased and threatened at gunpoint for not wanting to vote between a douche and a turd. This is South Park being South Park. Taking something real, the social pressure around voting, the way people treat political apathy as a moral failure, and cranking it up to an extreme to show what the underlying logic actually looks like when you follow it all the way. Stan gets captured, placed on a horse, and sent out of town into the wilderness as punishment for refusing to vote. His own community banishes him. The message from the town is clear. Not participating in this process is the worst thing you can do, worse than voting for either bad option, worse than acknowledging that both options are bad. He ends up at a PETA compound, which turns out to be exactly as strange as you would expect. The people living there have gone so far in their beliefs about animals that they have started interbreeding with them. It is as weird and disturbing as it sounds. But in the middle of all that strangeness, one of the PETA members says something to Stan that is the entire point of the episode. It is the line that people have been quoting ever since. He tells Stan, nearly every election since the beginning of time has been between some douche and some turd. They're the only people who suck up enough to make it that far in politics. That is it. That is the prediction. Not wrapped in complicated analysis, not hidden behind layers of satire, just stated plainly by a man at a PETA commune as if it is the most obvious thing in the world, because in South Park's view, it is. The system does not produce great candidates because the system does not reward greatness. It rewards people who are willing to do whatever it takes to get to the top, and that process filters out most of the people who might actually be worth voting for. What is left almost every time is a choice between two options that most voters do not actually want. Now you might be thinking, this is a pretty cynical thing for a cartoon to say, and you would be right. Parker and Stone have always been cynical about politics, which is actually part of why they have been able to describe it so accurately. They do not have a team they are rooting for. They do not have a candidate they want to win. When you are not trying to protect one side, you can see both sides more clearly. The episode came out in 2004 during a Bush-Kerry election that a lot of Americans found genuinely uninspiring. Many voters felt like neither option reflected what they actually wanted from a leader. Bush had already served one term and led the country into 2 wars. Kerry was his opponent, a senator who many people felt was stiff, disconnected, and hard to relate to. The show took that feeling, the specific frustration of being asked to care deeply about a choice you did not make and do not love, and turned it into 2 cartoon mascots. But here's the thing, that feeling did not go away in 2004. It came back in 2008, it came back in 2012, and then in 2016, it came back harder than it ever had before, because the 2 candidates that year were Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and when 2016 arrived, everyone went back to that episode. Parker and Stone knew exactly what they were doing in season 20, which covered the 2016 election. They brought the giant douche and the turd sandwich back, not as new characters invented for the season, literally the same ones from 2004. They reappeared as the labels for Trump and Clinton in the season 20 premiere, Member Berries. Randy Marsh tells a pollster that his family will be voting for the turd sandwich instead of the giant douche. Stan, hearing this, is annoyed, because this is exactly the situation he had been banished from town for refusing to accept 12 years earlier. The show was acknowledging something that most television refuses to acknowledge. It was not picking a side. It was not saying one of these candidates was fine and one was terrible. It was saying that both candidates had driven enormous numbers of people to the same place Stan had been in 2004, not wanting to choose, feeling like the choice itself was the problem, unsure whether participating in an election between 2 bad options meant anything at all. That is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to say out loud in American media. Most news networks, most political commentators, and most entertainment television picks a side. They may not say it directly, but their coverage makes clear which outcome they are pulling for. South Park has never done that, and Douche and Turd is the purest expression of that refusal. The episode is not telling you not to vote. Stan eventually votes. He picks the turd sandwich. His vote does not change the result. The giant douche wins in a landslide, and his parents then tell him that all votes matter anyway. The whole thing is designed to hold 2 things at the same time. Voting matters, and also the options you're given are usually bad. The episode also has something to say about the people around Stan during all of this. Kyle and Cartman spend the entire episode campaigning aggressively for their respective candidates. Kyle is passionate about giant douche. Cartman is passionate about turd sandwich. Neither of them has a real reason to prefer one over the other. These are joke mascots that were never meant to be taken seriously. But once the campaign started, both of them became fully committed soldiers for their side. They use bribes. They use fear. They argue with each other constantly. They treat this school mascot election like it is the most important thing that has ever happened. This is another thing the episode got exactly right. The polarization around the 2016 election, and every election after it, was not just about the candidates themselves. It was about how people on both sides became completely convinced that their side had to win, not because their candidate was great, but because the other candidate was unacceptable. The energy was not enthusiasm for someone. It was fear of someone else. Vote for the douche because the turd is worse. Vote for the turd because the douche is worse. Neither side was actually excited. They were just scared. Stan is the only character in the episode who sees this clearly, and the community punishes him for it. He gets spat on. His shirt is ripped off. He is placed on a horse with a bucket over his head and driven out of town. The show was making the point that in American political culture, refusing to play the game, refusing to pick a side and fight for it, is treated as a form of betrayal, even if the game is clearly broken, even if the options are genuinely bad. Opting out is the one thing that is not allowed. By 2024, the phrase giant douche versus turd sandwich had become one of the most commonly used descriptions for presidential elections in American internet culture. It shows up every 4 years. People make graphics with it. They quote it in political arguments. A reviewer on the episode's IMDb page, written in 2024, simply wrote, "It's 2024 and we're still dealing with a giant douche and a turd sandwich." TV Tropes, a website that catalogs patterns in film and television, documents the phrase under a section called mimetic mutation. meaning it spread so far and so naturally through culture that it took on a life of its own completely separate from the show it came from. A lot of people who use the phrase today have never seen the episode. They just absorb the saying from the people around them, the way you absorb any piece of language that turns out to describe something real well enough that it sticks. That is what happens when writing is genuinely accurate. It does not stay inside the thing it came from. It escapes. It becomes part of the language people use to describe their actual lives. And Douche and Turd did that in a way very few pieces of political satire ever manage. There is something else worth thinking about here, and it is the fact that this episode is 20 years old and the situation it describes has not improved. If anything, most people would say it has gotten worse. The two-party system that the PETA member explains to Stan has not changed. The process that produces candidates by filtering out anyone who is not willing to do whatever it takes has not changed. The social pressure to vote enthusiastically for options most people did not choose and do not love has not changed. South Park in 2004 was not saying this was new. The PETA member's line is specifically about elections since the beginning of time. The show was saying this is just how the machine works. This is the structure. And if you go back and look at elections from the 1990s, the 1980s, earlier, the pattern holds. Most presidential elections in American history have involved voters holding their noses and choosing the lesser of two options they did not love. The reason the episode hit so hard in 2016 specifically is because that year, the gap between what people wanted and what they were given felt wider than usual. The feelings Stan had in 2004, frustration, disengagement, the sense that participating was meaningless, were felt by a record number of voters in 2016, which is part of why turnout and third-party voting were notable that year. A lot of people were doing exactly what Stan did, looking at the choices, deciding both were bad, and either not showing up or writing someone else in or voting third party. And then, just like in the episode, the result came back. One of the two bad options won. Life continued. The machine kept moving. What Parker and Stone did with Douche and Turd is something that only works if you have no interest in making either side feel good about themselves. The episode does not comfort you. It does not tell you that your candidate is the right choice and the other one is the monster. It just holds up a mirror and says, look at what you are being asked to do. Look at how you are reacting to it. Look at what happens to the one person who refuses. That is genuinely difficult to do, and it is why the episode has lasted longer than almost anything else the show has made. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But while Douche and Turd described the shape of American elections with two mascots and a horse, there was something else South Park did years later that got even deeper into the psychology of why people vote. The way they vote. Not just the frustration with bad choices, but the actual feeling that drives someone toward a candidate like Trump in the first place. Parker and Stone found a way to put that feeling inside a small, round, talking piece of fruit, and what that fruit had to say turned out to be one of the most honest descriptions of the MAGA movement ever put on television. Section 4. Member Berries. How South Park Decoded Make America Great Again. On September 14th, 2016, 2 months before the presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, South Park started its 20th season with an episode called Member Berries. The episode introduced a new thing into the South Park world. A fruit, small, round, purple, and about the size of a grape. These little berries had faces and voices, and all they did was talk. Every single thing they said started with the same word. They would say things like, did remember Chewbacca, and remember the Bionic Man, and remember when Ghostbusters came out. They just sat there in a bowl, one after another, saying things that people remembered fondly from their childhoods and from decades past. And people loved eating them. The berries made them feel warm and relaxed. They made the stress of the current moment go away. They reminded people of a time that felt simpler and safer and better. Randy Marsh, one of the adult characters on the show, discovers the member berries and immediately gets hooked. He lies back on his couch holding a vine of them and just listens as they go through the list. Old movies, old TV shows, old songs, all the good stuff from back in the day. Then the berries start going further. Remember when there weren't so many Mexicans? One of them says. Randy stops chewing. Remember when marriage was just between a man and a woman? Remember feeling safe? Remember no ISIS? Remember Reagan? That shift from harmless nostalgia about movies and pop culture to something much darker is the entire point of what Parker and Stone were doing with the member berries. And understanding that shift is understanding one of the most accurate things South Park has ever said about American politics. The word nostalgia gets used a lot, but it just means missing the past, missing the way things used to be. Feeling like life was better before, and wanting to get back to that feeling somehow. This is something almost every human being experiences at some point. You hear an old song and it takes you back to being a kid. You smell something that reminds you of your grandmother's house. You watch an old movie you loved and feel a warmth that the present moment does not always give you. That kind of nostalgia is harmless. It is just memory. It is just the brain finding comfort in the familiar, but Parker and Stone were making a specific argument with the member berries. They were saying that nostalgia becomes something different when it gets pointed at politics. When the feeling of things were better before stops being about movies and TV shows and starts being about which people were in your country, which rights other people had, and what the social rules were, that is when nostalgia becomes a political tool. And it becomes a powerful one, because it does not feel like politics when you first encounter it. It feels like comfort, it feels like warmth, it feels like home. The member berries start with Chewbacca and end with immigration policy. That journey, from something completely innocent to something genuinely harmful, happens so gradually that Randy barely notices when the line gets crossed. He is already comfortable, he is already enjoying the feeling. By the time the berries start saying things that would have disturbed him in a different context, he has already lowered his guard because the earlier stuff felt so good. That is exactly how political nostalgia works. And it is exactly what the slogan, "Make America Great Again," was built on. Trump's slogan was not a policy, it was a feeling. It was not telling people what America would look like after it became great again. It was not explaining which specific things from the past would be brought back or how. It was just pointing at the past and saying that it was better than now, and that someone could take you back there. For a lot of people, that feeling landed hard. The promise of returning to something that had been lost, a version of America that felt safer, more familiar, more like home, was enormously appealing. Not because those people were bad, but because the present moment felt chaotic and uncertain and hard, and the idea of going back to something that felt solid and known was comforting in the same way that remembering Chewbacca is comforting. Parker and Stone understood this, and they also understood the thing that sits underneath it that almost nobody in mainstream political commentary wanted to say out loud, which is that the America people were nostalgic for, the version they wanted to get back to, was great for some people and not for others. The past that the member berries were pointing at was a past where certain groups had fewer rights, where certain people were not present in the same numbers, where certain conversations were not happening yet. When the berries said, "Remember when marriage was just between a man and a woman," they were not describing a neutral historical fact. They were describing a time when gay people could not legally marry, and framing that time as something to miss. The show was not saying that everyone who felt nostalgic was secretly racist or hateful. It was saying that the nostalgia was being used. It was being channeled. The feeling of missing the past was real, but the direction it was being pointed in, toward ethnic and cultural and social regression, was a choice being made by the people who understood how to weaponize that feeling for votes. By the end of season 20, the member berries end up in the White House. This is not a subtle image. The berries, small talking addictive little things that make people crave the past, have found their way into the center of American political power. The system has been taken over not by a grand plan or a complicated conspiracy, but by a feeling, by nostalgia, by the simple and deeply human desire to go back to something that felt better, regardless of whether it actually was better or whether going back is even possible. This is a genuinely original political observation. A lot of commentary on Trump's rise focused on economic anxiety or anger at elites or specific policy positions. Those things were all real, but South Park was identifying something underneath all of those things. The emotional engine running beneath the politics. The reason the slogan worked when the specific policy details did not matter to a large portion of the people it reached. The berries also keep spreading throughout the season. Once Randy gets hooked, others start eating them too. The addiction moves through the community. And each person who starts eating the berries gets pulled into the same loop, starting with comfortable, familiar things and gradually drifting toward the darker, more regressive places the berries eventually take you. The spread of the berries through South Park is a picture of how cultural and political nostalgia moves through a community. It does not announce itself as something dangerous. It arrives as something pleasant and shared. and by the time people notice where it is taking them, they are already too comfortable to stop. It is also important to understand the timing of this episode in the context of everything else that was happening in 2016. The episode aired on September 14th, 2016. The election was less than 2 months away. At that point, most polling and most political commentary was still suggesting that Hillary Clinton would win. The Member Berries storyline was not written with the knowledge of who would win. Parker and Stone were not predicting Trump's victory with this episode, at least not intentionally. They were describing the psychology that was driving his support. They were saying, look at this feeling that is moving through the country. Look at where it is coming from and where it is going. Look at what is actually underneath the bumper stickers and the rallies and the loud political arguments. And 2 months later, Trump won, which meant that everything the Member Berries had been describing, the nostalgia engine, the pull toward a past that not everyone had equally experienced as great, the addictive comfort of a political message built more on feeling than on policy, had been powerful enough to determine a presidential election. The show had not predicted the result, it had predicted the mechanism, and then the mechanism delivered the result. There's a specific scene in the Member Berries storyline that is worth describing in detail because it captures the whole thing so cleanly. Randy is at home with a vine of berries. He is relaxed. The berries are going through their list. They mention Star Wars, they mention old cartoons. They mention things from the 1980s that Randy grew up loving. He is smiling. He is content. And then one of the berries says, very casually, "Remember when Sinbad played a genie in that movie?" This is a reference to something called the Mandela effect, a phenomenon where large groups of people share a false memory of something that did not actually happen. A lot of people incorrectly remember a Sinbad movie where he played a genie. It does not exist, but the false memory is widespread and feels completely real to the people who have it. By including this reference, the show was layering in another point that nostalgia is not always even about something real. Sometimes the past people want to return to is a past they have constructed in their own heads. A version of how things were that has been softened and simplified by memory until it no longer resembles what actually happened. Make America Great Again taps directly into that. The America people were nostalgic for was not a documentary. It was a feeling, a general impression of safety and order and belonging that may or may not have matched the actual historical record, depending on who you were and where you lived. The Member Berries do not check whether their memories are accurate. They just keep serving them up, warm and familiar and addictive without asking any questions. Parker and Stone also connected the Member Berries to the wave of reboots and sequels that had taken over Hollywood around the same time. The Force Awakens had just come out the previous year. Ghostbusters was being remade. Every major entertainment property from the 1980s and 1990s was either being brought back or being planned for a comeback. In the season 20 premiere, Congress calls in director J.J. Abrams, famous for rebooting both Star Trek and Star Wars, to essentially reboot the national anthem because the current version is causing too much division. This connection between pop culture nostalgia and political nostalgia was one of the sharpest things the season did. The Member Berries represented both at once. The longing for the original Star Wars and the longing for a simpler America were, in the show's framing, coming from the same place inside people. The same emotional need was being served by both. And the industries that profited from that need, entertainment studios and political campaigns alike, were using the same basic mechanism. Give people the familiar, give people the warm feeling of something they already love, and they will keep coming back. By the end of the season, the Berries are fully in control. Their influence has spread from a bowl on a kitchen counter to the highest levels of political power. The show is saying that this kind of nostalgia, once it gets going, is very hard to stop. Not because it is forced on people, but because people choose it. It feels good. It is easier than engaging with a complicated present. And every single time it comes around, it starts with something completely harmless and ends somewhere that a lot of people would not have agreed to go if they had seen the destination from the beginning. The Member Berries are still part of the show years later. They pop up in the background of scenes, sitting on shelves, muttering their little memories to themselves. Parker and Stone have kept them around the same way they kept PC Principal around, because the thing they represent has not resolved. The hunger for the past, the political energy that runs on nostalgia. The way a simple emotional feeling can be turned into a movement. These things did not go away after 2016. They shaped the 2020 election. They shaped the 2024 election. They are woven into the fabric of how American politics currently works. A small talking grape predicted all of it in 2016, and it did it not by naming names or pointing at specific events, but by identifying the feeling underneath everything else. The feeling that once you recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere. In the slogans, in the rallies, in the way certain political messages land with certain people, in the genuine comfort that comes from being told that greatness is something you had and lost and can get back. The member Barrys understood something that a lot of political analysis missed entirely. Politics in the modern era is not primarily a debate about policy, it is a competition over feeling. Whoever can make the most people feel the most powerfully wins, and the feeling of nostalgia, of going home, of returning to something safe and known is one of the strongest feelings there is. South Park figured that out in September 2016 and put it in a bowl of talking grapes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But while the member Barrys were explaining why people voted the way they did, there was another storyline running through season 20 at the exact same time, one that was doing something just as sharp. While the member Barrys described the emotional engine behind Trump's rise, the show was simultaneously building a character who described the method, not the feeling that got Trump elected, the actual mechanism. The tool that was used to spread that feeling, weaponize it, and turn it into an electoral result. That character was Kyle's father, Gerald Broflovsky. And what he was doing in his spare time, anonymously in secret for reasons even he struggled to fully explain, turned out to be a preview of one of the most significant political forces of the decade. Section 5, Gerald Broflovsky and the Anatomy of the Modern Troll. Kyle Broflovsky's dad is one of the most boring characters on South Park. That is not an insult, it is the whole point. Gerald Broflovsky is a lawyer. He wears a nice sweater. He drives a reasonable car, he has a good job, a stable marriage, a house in a normal neighborhood, and 2 kids. He is the kind of adult who shows up to school meetings and uses words like concerning and we need to talk about this. He is, by every visible measure, a perfectly respectable member of his community, which is exactly why it was so effective when season 20 revealed that Gerald had been living a secret life online. His username was SkankHunt42. And under that name, he had been spending his evenings doing something he could not do as Gerald Broflovsky, respected lawyer and community member. He had been trolling people, posting cruel comments directed at women, targeting strangers online with mockery and personal attacks, going after anyone he felt like going after for no reason other than the fact that it made him laugh. When the reveal happened and the audience found out that Gerald was the troll everyone had been looking for, a lot of people expected the show to pivot into some kind of serious examination of why he did it, some dark backstory, some hidden trauma, some explanation that would make his behavior understandable in a heavy, meaningful way. Instead, Gerald's explanation was much simpler and much more uncomfortable. He did it because it was funny, that was it. He did it because he found it funny, because the anonymity of the internet let him do things that Gerald Broflovsky the lawyer could never do, and because the reactions he got from people made him feel something that his normal, comfortable, respectable life did not give him. Season 20 aired from September to December 2016, directly overlapping with the final months of the presidential election between Trump and Clinton. The Gerald trolling storyline ran the entire season alongside the Garrison/Trump campaign storyline, and Parker and Stone were very clearly building a connection between the two things. The connection was this: internet trolling and the rise of Trump were not separate phenomena. They were the same phenomenon expressing itself in 2 different places. The same energy that made Gerald want to go online and post cruel things anonymously was the same energy that was driving a significant portion of Trump's political support. The chaos, the disruption, the feeling of breaking rules that normally felt unbreakable, the appeal of watching something respectable and established get knocked over. This was a genuinely original observation in 2016. Most mainstream media coverage of the election was treating Trump's rise as a political story, about policies, about party dynamics, about economic conditions. The idea that it was also a cultural story, specifically connected to the explosion of online trolling culture that had been building for years, was not something that most news networks or political analysts had put together clearly yet. South Park had it in the first episode of season 20, 2 months before the election. One of the most important details of the Gerald storyline is that he is not a bad person in any other area of his life. He is a good father, he is a decent husband, he is professional at work. The show goes out of its way to establish that Skank Hunt 42 is not the product of a broken or angry man. It is a completely separate version of Gerald that only exists because the internet makes it possible. This matters because it pushed back against the way trolling was being discussed in 2016. The popular image of an internet troll was a young, lonely, isolated person sitting in a dark room, someone with obvious social problems and no real life to speak of, someone you could look at and immediately identify as the source of the problem, someone clearly outside the mainstream. Gerald destroyed that image. He was inside the mainstream. He was the mainstream. He was the neighbor, the colleague, the guy at the school meeting. And when he went home at night and opened his laptop, he became something completely different. Not because he was secretly a monster, but because the tools existed, the anonymity existed, and the reward, the laugh, the reaction, the feeling of doing something he was not supposed to do existed. Parker and Stone were saying that trolling was not a fringe behavior carried out by a specific type of broken person. It was a widespread human behavior that the internet had simply made possible for everyone, including the most respectable people in the room. The season also introduced the idea that trolling, at scale, had political consequences. This is where the Gerald storyline connected most directly to the election. In the show, Gerald's individual trolling eventually draws him into contact with a larger network of trolls. He is not alone. There are organized groups doing what he does, coordinating their attacks, choosing targets together, amplifying each other's content. The show depicted these trolls not as a random collection of individuals, but as something closer to a movement, disorganized on the surface, but connected underneath by a shared culture and a shared set of values, most of which came down to chaos is good, nothing is serious, and the funniest move is always the most disruptive one. By 2017 and 2018, reporting on the 2016 election had caught up to exactly this picture. Organized online communities had played a documented role in spreading content, targeting journalists and public figures, and shaping the information environment around the election. The specific combination of anonymous posting, coordinated harassment, and the weaponization of humor as a political tool had been a real factor in how the election played out. South Park had drawn that entire picture one season earlier. The show also depicted something that turned out to be specifically accurate, the way that trolling culture and mainstream political support overlapped in unexpected ways. The people participating in online harassment campaigns were not always politically engaged in any traditional sense. They were not necessarily loyal to a party or a candidate. A lot of them were, like Gerald, just in it for the disruption, for the reaction, for the fun of watching something respectable get knocked over. But that energy, directed at the right targets at the right time, had real political effects, regardless of whether the people generating it cared about politics at all. There is a scene in season 20 where Gerald sits in his car and watches the reaction to one of his troll posts in real time. A woman reads his comment on her phone. Her face changes. She is upset. Gerald watches this happen and smiles. He drives away satisfied. It is one of the most quietly disturbing moments in the season because it is so specific. The pleasure Gerald gets is not from the content of what he said. It is from the disruption. From the fact that he could reach through a screen and affect someone's emotional state without them knowing who he was or where he came from. The power of it, the invisibility of it, the ability to do something that would be socially catastrophic in his normal life and face zero consequences because of the wall the internet put between the action and the person taking it. This is the psychology of trolling captured as precisely as it has ever been captured in a piece of popular entertainment. And it is important to note that the show did not present Gerald as a cartoon villain enjoying other people's pain. He genuinely did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as a comedian, someone who found the reactions funny rather than someone who was deliberately causing damage. That gap between how trolls see themselves and the effect they actually have was one of the central tensions of online political life all the way through the decade following season 20. By the end of season 20, Gerald has to face what his trolling actually caused. The show does not let him walk away from it entirely without consequence. But it also does not deliver a simple moral lesson where Gerald admits he was wrong and promises to do better. It is more complicated than that. Gerald's final confrontation in the season is with a character called the Troll Hunter, someone who has dedicated their life to tracking down and exposing people like Gerald. And in that confrontation, Gerald asserts something that the show treats with genuine ambiguity. He says that what he does is funny, that his trolling has value, that there is something worth defending in the right to disrupt and mock and refuse to treat anything as sacred. He does not concede the argument cleanly, and the show does not concede it for him. This is the part of the Gerald storyline that critics at the time found most uncomfortable. South Park was not condemning trolling with a simple, clear message. It was sitting with the tension, acknowledging that the impulse behind it, less irreverence, chaos, the refusal to respect things just because they are supposed to be respected, was connected to something real and not entirely without value, while also showing the genuine damage it caused to real people. That tension did not get resolved in the show. It did not get resolved in real life either. The debate about where the line is between valuable disruption and genuine harm, between free expression online and targeted harassment, between political satire and political weapons, all of that was still running in full force in 2025. Gerald Broflovsky, the perfectly respectable lawyer in the nice sweater, turned out to be one of the most accurate political portraits South Park ever drew. Not because lawyers are secret trolls, but because the point was never specifically about lawyers. The point was that the person doing this did not look like what people expected, that the behavior was more widespread and more human than the fringe image suggested, that the internet had created a version of everyone that their normal life could never see. Season 20 put all of that together in 2016 and wrapped it around a federal election. It showed the trolling and the political campaign feeding off the same energy. It showed the chaos culture and the disruption politics as two expressions of the same underlying restlessness. It showed a country that was not just divided over policies, but over something more fundamental, over whether the rules and institutions and norms of public life deserved respect at all. Gerald never fully answers that question. The show does not either, but it asked it clearly and early in the exact moment when it needed to be asked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But while Gerald was trolling from his laptop and the member berries were spreading through South Park, one specific moment from the following season took everything the show had been building about Trump and distilled it into a single episode. An episode that did not just describe a pattern or capture a feeling, an episode that aired 2 days before a specific real event happened. That episode was called Put It Down, and what the fictional president tweeted in it landed on screens the same week the real one matched it almost word for word. Section 6, Put It Down, the tweet that came true in 48 hours. By season 21, South Park had already spent 2 full years building its version of Donald Trump through Mr. Garrison, the wall, the campaign, the election night rewrite, the member berries. The trolling. The show had covered the rise, the campaign, and the victory. And now, in 2017, Garrison was in the White House, and Parker and Stone had a new problem to work with. The president would not stop tweeting. This was not a subtle observation. By the fall of 2017, Trump's Twitter account had become one of the most talked about things in American political life. He used it constantly. He used it to attack people. He used it to make announcements his own staff had not been told about. He used it to start arguments with foreign leaders. He used it at all hours of the day and night. For a large portion of the country, waking up in the morning and checking what the president had posted overnight had become a daily ritual of anxiety. One situation in particular had been building across the summer and into the fall of 2017. Trump had been trading insults publicly with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. North Korea had been testing missiles. Trump had been responding on Twitter with language that was aggressive, personal, and in the view of many people, genuinely dangerous given the context. He had called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man in a speech at the United Nations. Kim Jong-un had called Trump a mentally deranged dotard. The two leaders of nuclear-armed countries were publicly calling each other names on the world stage while their militaries sat in the background. Parker and Stone were watching all of this in their usual way, in real time that week as they wrote the second episode of season 21. The episode was called Put It Down. It aired on September 20th, 2017. The central story follows a South Park kid named Tweak, who is completely falling apart over the situation between the United States and North Korea. Tweek is one of the more anxious characters on the show at the best of times, and the idea of two world leaders escalating toward a potential nuclear conflict is pushing him to his absolute limit. He cannot sleep, he cannot focus, he is terrified. His boyfriend Craig tries to calm him down. Craig is the opposite of Tweek in almost every way. Practical, calm, not prone to panic. Craig tells Tweek to call his congressman. Tweek says that will not work. Craig eventually convinces Tweek to try something different. If the president keeps making things worse with his tweets, maybe a gesture of genuine goodwill from an ordinary American could help. So Tweek bakes a batch of cupcakes and sends them to North Korea as a peace offering. A kid in Colorado sending baked goods to Kim Jong-un to show that not all Americans feel the same way as the president. It is the kind of idea that only makes sense in the logic of South Park, where the most absurd response to a political situation is usually also the most earnest one. For a brief moment, it works. The tension eases slightly. North Korea receives the cupcakes, the situation calms down, and then the president finds out about it. The moment the show's president, still depicted as Garrison, still unnamed, still clearly meant to be Trump, discovers that Tweek sent cupcakes to North Korea, he gets on his phone and starts tweeting about it. The tweet, as shown in the episode, reads, "I know that kid Tweek, he's fucking with you, North Korea. Get a clue. I bet he took a dump in the batter." The president has just publicly accused a child of sabotaging a peace gesture by putting feces in the cupcakes on Twitter to North Korea. While the military situation between the two countries is already on a knife's edge, Tweek reads the tweet and completely breaks down. "The president tweeted about me. Why would he do that?" he screams, and this becomes a running thread through the episode. The president keeps tweeting, keeps making things worse, keeps escalating a situation that common sense would suggest should be de-escalated. Each new tweet the fictional president sends pushes the North Korea situation further toward disaster. At one point, North Korea shoots a missile over the town of South Park in direct response to something the president posted. The episode's title, "Put It Down," referred to the president's phone. The message of the episode, delivered through a song that Tweek and Craig perform, was simply, "Please stop tweeting, just put the phone down." The most powerful man in the world is making a global crisis worse, one post at a time, and nobody can stop him because nobody can take his phone away. The episode aired on Wednesday, September 20th, 2017. 2 days later, on Friday, September 22nd, 2017, Donald Trump posted a tweet about Kim Jong-un. In it, he described Kim Jong-un as a madman who doesn't mind starving or killing his people, and threatened that he will be tested like never before. Multiple outlets immediately reported the connection. The tone of the real tweet, aggressive, personal, escalatory, posted without apparent concern for the diplomatic consequences, matched what the fictional president had been doing in the episode almost exactly. Trump had already been tweeting about North Korea in the days leading up to the episode, which was where Parker and Stone got the material from. But the specific post that came out 2 days after the episode aired pushed the parallel to a place that went beyond normal satire timing. The show had depicted the pattern, then the pattern produced a specific instance. Within 48 hours of the episode going out, a real tweet arrived that felt like it had been written by the same person the episode was mocking. This is what separates this particular prediction from most of the others. With the Canadian Wall, the show was describing a broad political dynamic. With the member berries, it was identifying an emotional pattern. With Gerald, it was drawing a cultural portrait. All of those were accurate in a general structural sense. But with Put It Down, the show aired a specific scenario. A president tweeting escalatory threats at Kim Jong-un and making a dangerous situation worse. And then a specific matching real-world event happened 2 days later. Parker and Stone did not cause this. They were not predicting it in any mystical sense. They were watching Trump tweet about North Korea that week, writing an episode about what they were watching, and the story they built was close enough to reality that reality produced a matching moment almost immediately after they published their version of it. The other storyline running through Put It Down adds another layer to how accurate the episode ended up being. While Tweek is falling apart over the North Korea situation, a separate group of South Park kids is running an awareness campaign about distracted driving. Specifically, they are trying to raise awareness about adults who are so consumed by reading the president's tweets on their phones that they keep running over children in the street. Throughout the episode, adults are shown driving their cars and reading their phones. They see a new tweet from the president. They react, scared, outraged, unable to look away, and while they are reacting, they run over kids over and over. The episode keeps cutting back to this. An adult reads a tweet, has a strong emotional reaction, and a child gets hit by a car. This was South Park's description of what the constant tweet cycle was doing to the American public. The president's Twitter account had become a machine for producing strong emotional reactions in millions of people simultaneously, repeatedly, at all hours. Each tweet demanded a response. Each response demanded more attention. The country was, in a very real sense, so focused on what the president was going to post next that normal life was suffering. People were not sleeping well. People were anxious in ways they could not fully explain. The ordinary business of daily life was being interrupted constantly by whatever the phone said next. The image of adults running over children because they could not stop looking at presidential tweets was extreme, obviously. But the thing it was describing, how an entire population held in a state of constant reactive attention by a single social media account, was something that mental health researchers, journalists, and ordinary people were all starting to document and describe in exactly those terms throughout 2017 and 2018. South Park put it in cartoon form in September 2017, using a child almost getting nuked and a distracted driving campaign as the delivery mechanism. There is something worth noting about how Parker and Stone handled the president's identity in season 21. They had used Garrison as the Trump stand-in throughout season 19 and season 20, but by season 21, they made a specific choice. The president in Put It Down is not referred to by name, he is just called the president. His Twitter avatar shown in the episode still looks like Garrison, but the character is deliberately vague, functioning more as a symbol of the presidency than as a specific named individual. This was a deliberate decision. Parker and Stone had said in interviews that they were pulling back from direct Trump parody because the reality had become so extreme that mocking it directly felt less useful than describing its effects. Instead of depicting Trump himself, they were depicting what it felt like to live under a presidency defined by constant social media provocation. The Tweak storyline is not really about Kim Jong-un. It is about what it is like to be an ordinary person, even a very small, anxious person in Colorado, whose daily emotional state is being dictated by whatever the most powerful person in the world decides to post that morning. That feeling was real. Millions of Americans were living it in 2017, and the episode named it clearly before most broader conversations about social media's effect on political mental health had fully taken shape. Put It Down is not the most celebrated episode of South Park. It is not the one that comes up first when people list their favorites. But within the specific story of how the show predicted American politics, it holds a unique position. Because it is the most precise moment the show ever had. Not the broadest prediction, not the most structurally accurate portrait, just the single tightest window between something the show depicted and something that actually happened. 2 days. The episode aired on a Wednesday. The matching tweet came on a Friday. In a show that had spent years describing patterns and tendencies and long-term political trajectories, this was the one time the prediction was measured not in years but in days. And the image it left behind, and a president on his phone making something dangerous worse, while the people around him beg him to just put it down, stayed accurate long after that specific Friday in September 2017. It described a dynamic that ran through Trump's entire first term and returned in his second. A leader who communicated primarily through social media posts, who escalated when conventional wisdom said to de-escalate, and whose relationship with his own phone was a source of constant anxiety for everyone paying attention. The show saw it in real time and put it on screen before the most memorable example of it had even happened yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, but as sharp as that 2-day window was, there is a prediction from much earlier in South Park's history that ended up being even more jaw-dropping when you measure the gap between what the show imagined and what real life eventually delivered. Because while Put It Down was predicting something days before it happened, there was a song from 1999, a song that got nominated for an Academy Award, that was predicting something 26 years before it happened. And in 2025, that song stopped being funny. Section 7, Blame Canada. From a 1999 Academy Award nomination to a 2025 trade war in the summer of 1999, South Park released its first movie. It was called South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, and it arrived in theaters on July 16, 1999. The film was loud, offensive, wildly funny, and underneath all of that, genuinely sharp about American culture and foreign policy. It got an R rating. It featured wall-to-wall profanity, a war between the United States and Canada, and a song that ended up being nominated for Best Original Song at the 72nd Academy Awards. That song was called Blame Canada, and for 25 years, it was a joke. A really good joke, performed brilliantly, with sharp lyrics and a catchy melody, built around one of the most absurd premises the show had ever constructed. The idea that America would go to war with Canada, its peaceful, polite, hockey-playing neighbor to the north, over something as ridiculous as a cartoon movie, was funny precisely because it was so impossible. So detached from anything that could realistically happen. So obviously designed to mock the American habit of finding external things to blame for internal problems. Then 2025 arrived, and the joke stopped being a joke. The plot of the movie starts simply enough. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny sneak into an R-rated movie starring Terrence and Phillip, two Canadian comedians who are beloved characters in the South Park universe. The movie is extremely vulgar. The boys come home having absorbed every piece of inappropriate language from it and start using it constantly. Their parents are horrified. They cannot understand where their children learn to talk like this. The answer, obviously, is the Canadian movie, so the parents of South Park decide that Canada is to blame, not the fact that their kids snuck into an R-rated film without permission, not any failure of their own parenting. Canada, the country that produced the content, the foreign place where the bad influence came from. This escalates quickly, the way things always do in South Park. A protest group forms, a movement builds, the US government gets involved. And eventually the United States declares full military war on Canada over the fact that a cartoon made Canadian characters said bad words, and American children repeated them. The whole thing is ridiculous by design. The movie is using an extreme fictional scenario to make a simple and accurate point. America has a long history of looking outward for something to blame when things go wrong domestically. Finding a foreign target, a country, a culture, a group of people from somewhere else, is often easier and more politically useful than looking inward. Blame Canada is the musical expression of that idea. The parents of South Park sing it together as they march toward war, listing all the ways Canada has corrupted their children and their country, demanding that something be done. The song was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song at the 72nd ceremony in February 2000. It did not win, but it was performed at the ceremony by Robin Williams, which is its own remarkable piece of trivia. A song about America blaming Canada for its problems was performed at the Oscars by one of the most beloved entertainers in the country. For 25 years, that was the story. A funny song from a funny movie about an absurd situation that could never actually happen. In early 2025, Donald Trump, in his second term as president, began imposing major tariffs on Canada. A tariff is essentially a tax on goods coming from another country. Trump's tariffs targeted Canadian steel, aluminum, and a wide range of other products. The initial tariff was 25% on most Canadian imports. Then Trump doubled the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum specifically. The stated reason shifted. At various points, the justification involved fentanyl crossing the border, trade imbalances, and national security. Trump also made repeated comments suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States, which Canadian politicians and citizens found deeply offensive. Canada did not absorb this quietly. In direct response to Trump's tariffs, Canada announced $29.8 billion in retaliatory tariffs targeting American goods. The relationship between the two countries, which had been one of the closest and most stable partnerships in the world for decades, deteriorated rapidly. Canadian politicians who had previously been friendly toward American conservative politics found themselves pushed into a more adversarial position simply by the circumstances. The Canadian public, which had historically been broadly positive toward the United States, shifted sharply in its attitudes. The internet noticed the South Park connection immediately. Posts started appearing across social media, pointing back to the 1999 movie. One user on X wrote, 25 years ago, the South Park movie was released in which the absurdist plot was Americans randomly blaming Canada for any problem they have. Going to war with Canada for no reason whatsoever. Trump has literally turned South Park into reality. Yeah, that post spread widely. It was followed by hundreds of similar observations from people who had either grown up with the movie or were encountering it for the first time, specifically because of the real-world parallel. The comparison was not just about the fact that America and Canada were in conflict, it was about the specific shape of the conflict. In the movie, America blames Canada for something that is not really Canada's fault, using it as a convenient external target to direct frustration that might otherwise have no clean outlet. In 2025, many Canadians and international observers describe Trump's tariffs in similar terms, as a political tool that used Canada as a target for economic and nationalist energy rather than as a genuine response to a real problem Canada had created. Colorado Governor Gerald made the connection official on March 16, 2025. He posted publicly on X in defense of Canada amid the tariff dispute. His post read, "Colorado thrives thanks to Canada." From high-paying jobs and thriving trade to tourism and even iconic characters from our state's legendary show, South Park, we're stronger together. He specifically named Ike Broflovsky, the Canadian-born adopted brother of Kyle on South Park, as an example of the cultural connection between Colorado and Canada. A sitting governor of an American state was using a South Park character to make a serious political point about real trade policy. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz also condemned the tariffs during the same period, calling them totally avoidable and warning about their effect on Midwestern economies tied to Canadian trade. The fact that actual elected officials were reaching for South Park references to describe what was happening in the real world says something specific about how accurately the 1999 movie had captured a dynamic that was now playing out in reality. The movie was not just vaguely related to the situation, it had described the precise emotional and political mechanism. Blame an external country, escalate the conflict, ignore the domestic roots of the frustration, so cleanly that it served as a better explanatory frame than most of the actual political commentary being written in real time. Then South Park itself responded. Comedy Central released the trailer for season 27 ahead of its July 2025 premiere. The trailer contained a lot of things. References to air traffic control problems, ketamine, the Statue of Liberty being dismantled by the French, and other clearly topical material. But one section stood out immediately to anyone following the Canada-US situation. The trailer showed a battalion of Canadian characters, the classic South Park Canadian design with the beady eyes and flapping heads, marching forward carrying hockey sticks and pitchforks, an army of Canadians ready for conflict. And at the very end of the trailer, the words "Blame Canada" appeared on screen, accompanied by the song's familiar melody. Parker and Stone were acknowledging the loop directly. The thing they had written as an absurd joke in 1999 had become close enough to real that they were bringing it back in 2025 as a direct response to the actual diplomatic situation between the two countries. The joke had lived long enough to become relevant again, except now the relevance was not metaphorical or loosely connected. It was specific. There was a real tariff war, there was real tension, there was real Canadian anger. And the song that had been written to mock the impulse to blame Canada was now serving as the soundtrack to an actual moment in which America was, in effect, blaming Canada. Season 27 went on to feature a storyline involving conflict between the US and Canada throughout the season. The show had been there first in 1999, come back to the Canada-US relationship in season 19 with the Canadian Wall episode in 2015, and now returned to it again in 2025 because the world had caught up to both of those earlier predictions. Simultaneously, the wall that Canada built to keep Americans out in 2015, the war that broke out in 1999, both of them sitting in the background of the real 2025 situation like blueprints that had been filed away and forgotten until someone found them useful again. There is something specific about the Blame Canada prediction that makes it different from the others covered in this essay. With the Garrison Trump storyline, Parker and Stone were clearly watching something in progress and building on it. Trump's campaign was happening, they responded. With the member berries, they were identifying a cultural and emotional pattern that was already visible if you looked closely. With Gerald, they were drawing from troll culture that already existed online. These were all sharp observations made in real time about things that were already present in the world. Blame Canada was different. When the movie came out in 1999, there was no specific political situation involving Canada and the United States that it was responding to. The Canada-US relationship in 1999 was genuinely calm and cooperative. The song was not a response to anything happening between the two countries. It was purely a satirical device for describing a general American habit, the habit of finding foreign targets for domestic frustration, using Canada as the most absurd possible example because Canada was the most obviously peaceful and non-threatening neighbor imaginable. The joke only worked because the scenario was impossible, and then 26 years later, the scenario happened. That gaps, 26 years between the prediction and the reality, is the longest of any South Park political moment in this entire essay. It is longer than the 12 years between Douche and Turd and the 2016 election. It is longer than the 10 years between the Canadian Wall episode and the 2025 trade war. It is the furthest the show has ever reached, without trying to reach at all, and still landed on something real. Parker and Stone were not trying to predict 2025 in 1999. They were just following a joke about American culture to its most extreme conclusion. And the most extreme conclusion, America genuinely in conflict with Canada over something that felt thin and politically constructed, turned out not to be a conclusion at all. It turned out to be a preview. The song Blame Canada ends with the parents of South Park demanding that someone must be made to pay, that Canada must be dealt with, and that the solution to their problems is out there somewhere north of the border. The energy in the song is not rational. It is not based on a careful accounting of what Canada actually did. It is emotional. It is about finding a target. It is about the relief that comes from having something outside yourself to point at when things feel wrong. That feeling, and the political leaders who know how to channel it, did not go away when the credits rolled in 1999. It was still there in 2025. It will probably be there in 2045, because it is not specific to any one moment or any one president. It is a recurring feature of how political anger gets managed and directed. South Park identified it in a song, got the song nominated for an Academy Award, and then waited a quarter century for the world to prove them right. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and while the Canada storyline was playing out and real governors were quoting South Park in political arguments, something else was happening simultaneously in 2025 that made the predictions from 2015 feel even more complete. Because season 27 was not just about Canada and trade wars. Season 27 was the season the White House decided it needed to officially respond to a cartoon. And what that response said, and what happened after it, was the most remarkable chapter in the entire story of South Park and American politics. Section 8, Season 27. When the White House actually responded for most of South Park's history, the people being mocked by the show did not respond officially. Politicians, celebrities, corporations, religious groups, they all got hit by the show at various points across its nearly 30 years. Some complained publicly, some got upset, some gave interviews where they expressed how unhappy they were. But very few of them did what the Trump White House did on July 24th, 2025. They issued an official statement, not a tweet from a personal account, not a comment made in passing during an interview. An official statement released to The Hollywood Reporter from a White House spokesperson responding directly to a South Park episode that had aired the night before. The statement called the show irrelevant. It called the creators uninspired. It said the show was hanging on by a thread and desperate for attention. The White House had officially responded to a cartoon. And in doing so, they handed South Park the single greatest piece of evidence in the show's entire history that it was still doing exactly what it had always done, saying the thing that the people in power most did not want said. To understand what triggered the statement, you need to know what happened on the night of July 23rd, 2025. That was the night season 27 of South Park premiered on Comedy Central. The episode was called Sermon on the Mount, and it was, by any measure, the most direct and aggressive thing Parker and Stone had done in years. For most of South Park's run, Trump had been depicted indirectly. From season 19 through season 26, the show used Mr. Garrison as its Trump stand-in. Garrison ran the campaign, Garrison won the election, Garrison sat in the Oval Office. The real Trump was kept at a distance, his name rarely used, his face not directly drawn. Parker and Stone had explained this as a creative choice. They felt using a fictional character gave them more flexibility and kept the satire from feeling too narrow. Season 27 changed that. In Sermon on the Mount, Donald Trump appeared as himself, not as Garrison, not as a vague, unnamed president. Trump depicted directly in the White House in 2025 during his second term. This was the first time in the show's history that Trump had been portrayed as a direct character in this way, and Parker and Stone went after him without restraint. The episode depicted Trump suing the town of South Park after residents challenged the presence of Jesus Christ, the actual Jesus appearing as a character in the local elementary school. Trump was shown demanding that people settle rather than fight him in court. There were multiple jokes about the size of Trump's penis, including a painting in the White House that Trump objected to. There was a sequence depicting Trump trying to be romantic with Satan in bed, a callback to how the show had depicted Saddam Hussein in the 1999 movie, where Saddam was portrayed as Satan's abusive and needy partner. By connecting Trump to that specific earlier portrayal, Parker and Stone were drawing a direct line between how they saw the two figures. The episode also included a deepfake rendering of Trump, an AI-generated visual, which was the kind of thing that had never been done on the show before and pushed the satire into territory that felt genuinely new even for South Park. The timing of the episode was not accidental. Earlier that same day, July 23, 2025, Paramount Global had announced a massive new deal with Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The deal was reportedly worth around $1.5 billion. It covered 5 years of new episodes, with 10 episodes per year airing on Comedy Central and streaming on Paramount+. It also gave Paramount Plus the streaming rights to all previous seasons of the show, and over 300 episodes spanning nearly 3 decades. The same week this deal was announced, Paramount had been in the news for very different reasons. The company had recently settled a lawsuit with Trump over his claim that CBS News, which is owned by Paramount, had selectively edited an interview with Kamala Harris during the 2024 election campaign. That settlement had drawn criticism from people who felt Paramount had capitulated to political pressure. And just days before the South Park premiere, CBS had announced it was canceling The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, which had been one of the most prominent late-night voices critical of Trump. The network said it was a financial decision. The environment, in other words, was one where major media companies appeared to be pulling back from anything that might upset the Trump administration. And then South Park released an episode depicting Trump in bed with Satan and joking about his genitals. Inside the episode itself, Jesus addresses the situation directly. He tells the South Park residents that they should consider settling their lawsuit. You guys saw what happened to CBS. Jesus says in the episode, yeah, well, guess who owns CBS? Paramount. Do you really want to end up like Colbert? The show was calling out its own parent company in the episode on the night the massive new deal with that parent company was announced. Parker and Stone were making a point about the difference between what they were doing and what everyone else in media appeared to be doing. Everyone else was settling. Everyone else was pulling back. South Park was going harder. The next morning, July 24th, the White House responded. White House Assistant Press Secretary Taylor Rogers released a statement to The Hollywood Reporter. It read, "The left's hypocrisy truly has no end. For years, they have come after South Park for what they labeled as offensive content, but suddenly they are praising the show. Just like the creators of South Park, the left has no authentic or original content, which is why their popularity continues to hit record lows. This show hasn't been relevant for over 20 years and is hanging on by a thread with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention. President Trump has delivered on more promises in just 6 months than any other president in our country's history. And no fourth-rate show can derail President Trump's hot streak." A separate administration official told Deadline that Trump was personally seething over what the show had done. The statement contained a factual problem that became immediately obvious to anyone who looked it up. The White House said the show had not been relevant for over 20 years. The ratings for the season 27 premiere, released shortly after, showed that the episode had been watched by nearly 6 million people across Comedy Central and Paramount Plus. That was the largest audience for a South Park season premiere in 25 years. It was up 68% compared to the season 26 premiere the year before. By Nielsen's measurement, it scored the best season premiere rating in 3 years. The show the White House called irrelevant had just delivered its biggest numbers since 1999. Parker and Stone's response came at Comic-Con, where Trey Parker appeared on a panel shortly after the White House statement was released. He was asked about the administration's reaction to the episode. He deadpanned, "We're terribly sorry." That was it. 2 words, delivered completely flatly. The audience laughed. Parker moved on. It was, in its own way, as precise a response as any long speech could have been. The White House had issued a formal official statement. The creator of the show responded with the same energy he had been bringing to South Park for nearly 30 years. Complete refusal to take the outrage seriously, delivered with perfect timing. Parker also shared something from the production process of the episode during the same panel. He revealed that their producers at Paramount had sent a note on the episode before it aired. The note said they were going to blur the penis shot, the visual joke about Trump's genitals that appeared in the episode. Parker said he told them, "No, you're not gonna blur the penis." They did not blur it. It aired uncensored. On the same night, Paramount announced a $1.5 billion deal that depended on the relationship between the company and its most valuable creative asset. Parker and Stone had enough leverage and apparently enough conviction to refuse to soften the joke, and Paramount let it through. The story did not end with the White House statement. 2 weeks later, season 27's second episode aired. It was called Gotta Nut, and it featured a storyline involving ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, conducting raids in South Park. The episode also depicted Kristi Noem, Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, as a character who shoots dogs, has heavily altered lips from cosmetic procedures, and raids a children's production of Dora the Explorer, arresting anyone she suspects of it. Being Hispanic. The Department of Homeland Security, the actual government department that oversees ICE, then used an image from the season 27 trailer on their official social media to promote their real ICE operations. A government department that had just been brutally mocked in a cartoon episode decided to use imagery from that cartoon's promotional material to advertise their own work. Whether this was deliberate or a failure of awareness inside the department, the effect was the same. South Park responded publicly on social media with a simple question: wait, so we are relevant? It was a direct callback to the White House statement 2 weeks earlier that had called the show irrelevant. The government had just proven the opposite by voluntarily engaging with South Park content in an official capacity. Kristi Noem herself responded to her depiction in the episode. She told a radio program that she had not watched it because she had been going over budget numbers. She said it was lazy to make fun of women for how they look, and that if the show wanted to criticize her work, they should do that instead. She said it was always the liberals and extremists who made fun of women's appearances. Conservative commentator Charlie Kirk, who was also depicted in the same episode, had the opposite reaction. He called his South Park portrayal a badge of honor. Kirk was assassinated on September 10th, 2025. Following his death, the episode was pulled from reruns out of respect, though it remained available on streaming platforms. What the entire season 27 arc demonstrated, from the premiere to the White House response to the DHS posting to Kristi Noem's interview, was something that went beyond any individual prediction the show had made. It showed that South Park had become embedded in the actual fabric of American political life in a way that very few pieces of entertainment ever achieve. The show was not just commenting on politics from the outside. Politicians were responding to it. Government departments were accidentally promoting it. Cabinet members were giving interviews about it. The White House was issuing formal statements about it. A cartoon made by two men in Colorado had become something the most powerful office in the world felt it needed to officially address. And the fact that the White House felt that need, felt that a South Park episode required a formal response, was itself the clearest possible confirmation of every prediction the show had made across the previous decade. If the show were truly irrelevant, the statement would never have been written. The statement was written because the episode landed, because it was seen, because it said something that resonated widely enough that ignoring it was not an option. South Park had spent 10 years describing what American politics was becoming, and by 2025, American politics was responding to South Park. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even with all of that, the White House statement, the DHS mishap, the ratings record, there is still one piece of the season 27 story that has not been told yet. Because while the premiere was making headlines and cabinet members were giving interviews, the show was also doing something in its second episode that connected directly back to a prediction from the very beginning of this whole story. A prediction about immigration, about raids, and about what it looks like when the joke from 2015 fully arrives in the real world. And the way it arrived involved ICE vehicles, a children's theater production, and a government department that could not help but get involved. Section 9, Gotta Nut, ICE raids, Dora the Explorer, and the government that couldn't look away. 2 weeks after the White House called South Park irrelevant, the Department of Homeland Security used a South Park image to promote their own work. Online. That sequence of events, official irrelevance declaration followed almost immediately by official engagement, is the kind of thing that sounds made up, but it happened. And to understand why it happened and why it matters within the larger story of South Park predicting American politics, you have to go back to where the immigration story actually started for the show. Not in 2025, not even in season 27. Back to September 2015, back to Mr. Garrison and the Canadian immigrants flooding South Park, back to the episode that started everything, because what happened in the second episode of season 27 was not a new South Park prediction. It was the completion of one. It was the 2015 storyline arriving fully in the real world 10 years later, with actual government vehicles and an actual cabinet member and an actual social media post from an actual federal department. The circle closed in August 2025, and it closed around a children's production of Dora the Explorer. The second episode of season 27 was called Got a Nut. Its official description was straightforward, Mr. Mackey loses his job and tries to find a new way to make a living, but running through the episode was something much bigger than Mr. Mackey's career problems. The episode depicted ICE agents conducting raids in South Park, not as background detail, as a central part of the episode's world. Black vehicles, masked agents, people being swept up and taken away. The raids happened in the middle of ordinary community life, interrupting normal situations in the way that real immigration enforcement operations had been doing across the United States throughout 2025. One of those situations was a local children's theater production of Dora the Explorer Live. For anyone who does not know, Dora the Explorer is a beloved children's cartoon character, a young Latina girl who goes on adventures. The show ran for years and was enormously popular with young children. In the South Park episode, Kristi Noem's ICE agents raid the production and begin arresting anyone they suspect of being Hispanic. The Dora the Explorer show becomes an immigration enforcement operation. Children watching a harmless kid's performance find themselves in the middle of a raid. This is South Park doing what South Park does best, taking a real policy and following it to its most extreme and absurd logical endpoint. Real ICE operations in 2025 were happening in schools, in churches, in workplaces, in public spaces. Parker and Stone took that reality and placed it inside the most innocent possible setting they could imagine. A children's theater show featuring the most recognizable Latina character in children's entertainment, to make the point as sharply as possible. Kristi Noem's depiction in the episode went beyond the raid storyline. The show depicted her with heavily exaggerated oversized lips, a reference to widespread public commentary about cosmetic procedures she had allegedly undergone. She was shown shooting dogs who crossed her path, a reference to a real controversy from earlier in 2025 where Noem had written in a book about shooting her own dog. She was portrayed as aggressive, vain, and indifferent to the people her department was affecting. Noem responded publicly. She appeared on a radio program and said she had not watched the episode because she had been going over budget numbers. She said it was lazy to mock women for how they look. She said that if the show wanted to criticize her actual work, they should do that, but that clearly they could not, so they just picked something petty about her appearance. She said it was always the liberals and the extremists who went after women this way. There are two things worth noting about Noem's response. First, she had not watched the episode. She was responding to descriptions of it rather than to the episode itself. Second, the episode had in fact depicted her conducting immigration raids and shooting dogs, both of which were direct references to her actual public record and her actual stated policies, alongside the appearance jokes. The show was criticizing her work. The appearance material was part of the satire, but it was not the whole thing. Parker and Stone's approach to Noem was the same approach they have always taken. Find the thing a person most does not want talked about, combine it with the thing they are most publicly known for, and put both on screen at the same time. Noem's response, by focusing exclusively on the appearance jokes while dismissing any suggestion that the show was engaging with her policies, became its own kind of story. Charlie Kirk was also depicted in the same episode. Kirk was a prominent conservative commentator who had been publicly supportive of Trump and the broader MAGA movement for years. His reaction to his South Park portrayal was the complete opposite of Noem's. Kirk said it was a badge of honor. He was not upset, he was pleased. Being depicted on South Park, even unfavorably, was in his view a mark of cultural significance. It meant you had made it to the level where the most culturally embedded satire show in America felt you were worth their time. Kirk was assassinated on September 10th, 2025. Following his death, the episode was pulled from reruns. It remained available on streaming platforms, but Comedy Central stopped airing it in rotation out of respect. This is worth noting simply as a factual record of what happened. The episode existed, it depicted a real person, and that person died violently during the same season it aired. Now to the detail that became the most talked about part of the whole season 27 second episode story. Before Got a Nut aired, Comedy Central had released a promotional trailer for season 27 that included brief footage from upcoming episodes. That trailer included imagery related to the ICE raid storyline, masked agents, black vehicles, the visual language of immigration enforcement dropped into the South Park animation style. The Department of Homeland Security, the federal government department that oversees ICE, posted that image on their official social media account to promote their actual immigration enforcement work. A real government department responsible for real operations affecting real people used imagery from a satirical cartoon that was explicitly mocking their department and their secretary to advertise themselves. South Park's response on social media was immediate and direct. They posted, "Wait, so we are relevant?" 4 words. A direct callback to the White House statement from 2 weeks earlier that had declared the show irrelevant and dismissed it as desperate for attention. The government had just demonstrated the opposite by voluntarily using South Park content for official promotional purposes. Whether the person who posted it for DHS had not watched the episode, had not read the White House statement, or simply thought the imagery looked good regardless of context, the result was the same. The administration had handed South Park the perfect punchline to the White House's own statement. The situation got wide coverage. It was reported on by multiple outlets. The combination of the White House calling the show irrelevant and then a government department using the show's imagery for official promotion in the space of 2 weeks became a story in itself. A story about the strange relationship between the Trump administration and the show that had been mocking it for a decade. But underneath all of the back and forth and the social media moments and the Kristi Noem interviews, there was something more significant happening in the Got a Nut episode that connected it back to the beginning of everything covered in this essay. In September 2015, Mr. Garrison launched a campaign against illegal Canadian immigrants in South Park. He wanted to remove them. He wanted to build a wall. He wanted aggressive enforcement of the border. The show depicted a town mobilized around immigration as the central political issue, with an angry political figure driving the energy and an enforcement mentality taking over. At the time, that was a prediction. Trump was 3 months into his campaign. The wall was a campaign promise. ICE raids as a dominant feature of daily American life was something people were arguing about in the abstract. By August 2025, in the second episode of season 27, South Park depicted ICE raids happening in the middle of its town, not as a prediction, as a description of something that was currently happening across the United States. The immigration enforcement machinery that Garrison had been promising in cartoon form in 2015 had become a real operating part of American life. And the show was now depicting it not as a future possibility, but as a present reality, with the same visual language, the same political energy, and the same community disruption that the 2015 episodes had described a decade earlier. The prediction had become the present, and the show had moved with it, from satirizing the promise of enforcement to satirizing the enforcement itself. 10 years. Same subject, completely different relationship to reality. There is one more thing the Got a Nut situation showed that is worth thinking about. The Department of Homeland Security posting that trailer image was almost certainly not a deliberate act of engagement with South Park's satire. It was almost certainly a mistake. Someone in a communications role saw imagery that fit their message, did not fully process where it came from or what the show was saying about their department, and posted it, a simple oversight. But that oversight happened because South Park's visual language, the flat colors, the simple animation, the unmistakable style, had become so embedded in American culture that someone working in a federal government communications role apparently did not stop to think carefully about what they were borrowing. The show had been in the background of American life for so long, commenting on it so consistently that even the people being mocked by it had absorbed it to the point where they could accidentally use it for their own purposes. That is a strange kind of cultural power, not the power of being loved or respected by the people in charge. The power of being so deeply woven into the fabric of the culture that even your critics and your targets cannot fully separate themselves from you. South Park had been threading that needle since 1997. By 2025, the thread had gone through the White House, through the Department of Homeland Security, through cabinet member interviews, and through a children's production of Dora the Explorer. And through all of it, now through every statement and response and accidental endorsement, the show had kept doing the same thing it had been doing since its very first season, watching, writing, following the logic of what it saw to wherever that logic led. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which raises the question that the next section is going to answer. Not what South Park predicted, and not just that it predicted it, but how. How two men in Colorado writing cartoons about children in a small mountain town managed to consistently describe where American politics was going before it got there. The method behind all of it, the specific thing Parker and Stone do that produces these results again and again, because it turns out the answer is both simpler and more interesting than most people expect. Section 10. Sponsored content. South Park predicted fake news before fake news was a word in November 2015, while Mr. Garrison was running his Canadian Wall campaign and PC Principal was enforcing political correctness at South Park Elementary. The show quietly aired an episode that predicted something completely different. Not a wall, not a political candidate, not cancel culture, it predicted the death of the news. The episode was called Sponsored Content. It aired on November 18th, 2015, and it followed Jimmy Valmer, South Park Elementary's resident stand-up comedian who uses crutches, as he ran the school newspaper. Jimmy is proud of his paper. He cares about it. He writes real stories, reports real things, and treats the whole operation with the kind of seriousness that a 4th grade school newspaper does not usually receive. The problem is that everyone around Jimmy has lost the ability to tell the difference between a real news story and an advertisement, not as a small inconvenience, as a fundamental, spreading, unstoppable condition. The adults in South Park are reading their news online, and they genuinely cannot distinguish content that is meant to inform them from content that is designed to sell them something. The two things look identical to them. The ads have gotten so good at pretending to be news, and the news has gotten so comfortable borrowing the style of ads, that the line between them has completely disappeared for most people. Jimmy can still see it. He reads a page and immediately knows what is real and what is not. This ability is treated in the episode as almost supernatural, something so rare that a group of former journalists approaches him specifically because of it. They tell Jimmy that what he can do is extraordinary, that most people have lost it entirely. The specific thing the episode was targeting was something called native advertising, though the show never uses that term because the show never uses terms that require explanation. Native advertising is just when a paid advertisement is designed to look exactly like a regular article or news story. You scroll through a website, you see something that looks like a piece of journalism, you read it, and only at the very bottom in small print does it say sponsored content, meaning a company paid for it to be there. It is not a news story. It is an ad, but it is dressed as a news story so carefully that most people do not notice the difference. By 2015, this had become a massive and growing part of how online media worked. News websites were struggling to make money from traditional advertising, so they started accepting money from companies to publish content that looked editorial but was actually promotional. The practice was widespread, it was profitable, and it was making the internet a place where the difference between information and sales pitch was getting harder to find every day. South Park turned this into a season 19 storyline, and then it connected that storyline to something much bigger. The episode's deeper argument, built across the season 19 finale arc, was that the blurring of news and advertising was not just an internet problem, it was a political problem. It was a democracy problem, because if people cannot tell what is real information and what is a constructed message designed to make them feel or do something specific, then the entire system of being an informed citizen starts to break down. This is the thing that sponsored content was describing in November 2015, more than a year before the phrase fake news entered mainstream political vocabulary. The term fake news became one of the defining phrases of the 2016 election and everything that followed it. At first, it described actual fabricated stories, made up articles with false headlines that spread on social media because they confirmed what certain people already wanted to believe. Then Trump began using the phrase to describe real journalism he did not like, which flipped the meaning entirely. By 2017 and 2018, fake news had become one of the most fought over terms in American political life. Who was producing it? What counted as it? Whether the mainstream media was guilty of it? Whether the people accusing others of it were themselves the problem? South Park had not used the phrase. But the condition it described in sponsored content, in a world where real information and manufactured messaging have become indistinguishable to most people, where the skills needed to tell them apart are vanishingly rare, and where the people who profit from the confusion are actively working to keep it going, was exactly the condition that the fake news debate was really about underneath all the political noise. The season 19 finale took the sponsored content idea even further and connected it to everything else the season had been building. It revealed that PC Principal and the enforcer of political correctness, who had been running South Park Elementary all season, had been unknowingly working for the ads. Not deliberately, he had no idea. But the wave of political correctness he had been enforcing, the gentrification he had been part of, the social changes he had been driving through the town, all of it had been engineered to make South Park's residents more obedient, more predictable, and more receptive to advertising. The argument was specific and uncomfortable. Forced political correctness in the show's framing produced people who were afraid to say the wrong thing. People who were afraid to say the wrong thing stopped asking hard questions. People who stopped asking hard questions became easier to sell to. The corporations running the ads were not behind the PC movement for ideological reasons. They were behind it because it was good for business. This is a complicated idea, and South Park did not deliver it gently. But what it was pointing at, the overlap between corporate interests and progressive cultural politics, and the way large companies adopted the language of social justice while continuing to operate in ways that served their bottom line above. Everything else became one of the most debated topics in American political and cultural life across the following decade. By 2020, it had a name: corporate activism, brands releasing statements about social issues, companies changing their logo colors during awareness months while their actual labor practices remained unchanged. The performance of values as a marketing strategy. South Park described the mechanism behind that in 2015. Not as a prediction of specific events, but as an identification of a specific way that power operates, using the appearance of moral concern as a tool for maintaining control. Jimmy's role in the episode as the person who can still tell ads from news is worth focusing on for a moment. The show makes him a hero specifically because of this skill. In a world where everyone else has lost the ability to distinguish real information from constructed messaging, Jimmy's clarity makes him dangerous to the people who benefit from the confusion. PC Principal tries to shut down his newspaper. He gets replaced as editor. People with money try to buy him out. The entire machinery of the episode is directed at silencing the one person who can still read clearly. This maps directly onto what happened to a lot of actual journalists and fact-checkers during the period following the 2016 election. The specific skill of verifying information, of reading something and being able to determine whether it was real or constructed, became politically charged in a way it had never been before. Fact-checkers were accused of bias. Journalists who called out false claims were dismissed as part of a corrupt establishment. The ability to distinguish real from fake, which Jimmy has in the episode, became in real life not just rare, but actively attacked by people who preferred the confusion. South Park put Jimmy in that position in November 2015. The culture caught up to it within a year and has been living in it ever since. There is also a specific detail in sponsored content that lands differently now than it did when the episode first aired. In one scene, Jimmy reads a news page and immediately identifies which stories are real and which are ads. He does this effortlessly, almost without thinking. The other characters watch him do it with something close to awe. They cannot see what he sees. The page looks the same to them regardless of what is real and what is paid for. What made this detail feel like a small joke in 2015, that most people cannot tell the difference between news and advertising, well, feels like a straightforward description of reality now. The information environment that exists today, with algorithm-driven social media feeds mixing genuine reporting with paid promotion, with opinion, with satire, with outright fabrication, has created exactly the condition that episode was warning about. The average person scrolling through their feed in 2025 is swimming in a mixture of content types with no reliable way of knowing which is which without significant effort. Jimmy could tell, most people cannot. And the people who profit from the confusion have spent the years since 2015 making the confusion deeper and harder to escape. Sponsored content is not the South Park episode most people bring up when they talk about the show's political predictions. It does not have the dramatic specificity of the Garrison/Trump storyline, or the clear timestamp of the Kim Jong-un tweet, or the 26-year gap of the Blame Canada situation. It works more quietly. But in some ways, it is the most complete prediction of all, because what it described was not a specific event or a specific political figure. It described the environment inside which all of the other predictions played out. The world where real information is hard to find. The world where the line between news and messaging has been deliberately blurred. The world where the skills needed to navigate that blur are increasingly rare and increasingly necessary. Every political prediction South Park made across these sections existed inside that environment. The Garrison/Trump parallels spread partly because people were already consuming information in a system where serious and satirical and false all looked the same. The member berries worked as a political tool partly because the nostalgic messaging they represented could be packaged and delivered through the same channels as actual news. The trolling Gerald did was effective partly because the information environment had no reliable mechanism for separating deliberate disruption from genuine opinion. South Park saw the root in 2015. The branches grew across the decade that followed. And while sponsored content was identifying the environment, there is one final piece of the South Park political story that pulls everything together. Not just what was predicted, but how the prediction kept happening and what it says about the two men who kept making it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, because Parker and Stone never claimed to have a crystal ball. They never said they were predicting anything. And the explanation for how they kept getting it right is both simpler and more revealing than any claim of special insight. It turns out the method was the show itself. Section 11, the method behind the magic. How South Park keeps writing tomorrow's headlines today. At some point while reading through everything covered in this essay, a reasonable question starts forming. How? How did two men writing a cartoon about children in a small Colorado mountain town consistently describe where American politics was going before it got there? How did they get the wall right, and the cancel culture right, and the nostalgia politics right, and the trolling right, and the tweet right, and the Canada situation right, and the fake news right? How did a show that has been on the air since 1997 manage to stay not just relevant, but genuinely ahead of the curve across nearly 3 decades of political change? The answer is not magic. It is not some special gift that Parker and Stone have that nobody else has. It is not luck, though timing plays a role. The answer is a specific way of working that almost no other television show in history has used, combined with a specific set of values that almost no other television show in history has maintained consistently. When you understand both of those things, the predictions stop seeming mysterious. They start seeming almost inevitable. The first and most important part of the method is the production schedule. Most animated television shows take months to produce a single episode. The writing, the recording, the animation, the editing, all of it stacked together means that by the time most animated shows reach their audience, the material inside them was conceived 6 months to a year earlier. This is fine for shows that are not trying to comment on current events. But it makes political satire almost impossible because politics moves fast, and a joke about something that happened 8 months ago lands very differently than a joke about something that happened last week. South Park solved this problem by doing something that the animation industry considered essentially impossible when Parker and Stone first started doing it. They write, animate, record, and finish each episode in approximately 6 days before it airs. 6 days, from blank page to finished episode. Parker and Stone essentially live inside the production of each episode for almost a week straight, working around the clock, building everything in real time. This is why South Park can air an episode about something that happened on Monday by Wednesday night of the same week. It is why the show could air an episode the day after an election result. It is why Put It Down could be about something Trump was doing on Twitter that same week and end up airing 2 days before the most relevant matching tweets. The 6-day schedule means South Park is always working with the actual present moment rather than a version of the world from months earlier. Every other show is writing about the past. South Park is writing about now. And writing about now means that when you follow an idea to its conclusion, that conclusion lands in a world that is already primed to receive it, because the world is still living in the exact moment the show is describing. The second part of the method is what Parker and Stone actually do during those 6 days. They do not just report on what is happening, they ask where it is going. This sounds simple, it is actually very rare. Most political commentary, on television, online, in newspapers, describes what is currently happening. It explains the event, it reacts to the event, it discusses the event's immediate consequences. Very little of it consistently asks the next question, which is, if this continues, where does it end up? Parker and Stone asked that question every single time. When they saw Trump's 2015 campaign, they did not just parody the rallies and the hat. They asked, what does a country look like after a leader like this wins? They answered that question with the Canadian Trump storyline, a country that had become a wreck with its citizens fleeing because the joke went on too long. When they saw political correctness growing on college campuses, they did not just mock the specific incidents. They asked, what does a community look like when this becomes the dominant enforcement mechanism? They answered with PC principal beating a child in a bathroom for using the wrong word. Following an idea to its endpoint is a skill. It requires being willing to go somewhere uncomfortable. It requires not stopping at the version of the idea that makes everyone feel okay. Most people and most institutions stop before the endpoint because the endpoint is usually where the uncomfortable truth lives. Parker and Stone have never stopped before the endpoint. Their show's entire history is built on going past the point where most people get nervous and seeing what is on the other side. The third part of the method is the most important and the hardest to replicate. Parker and Stone do not have a side. This sounds like a small thing. It is not. Having no side, genuinely not just claiming to be neutral while leaning clearly in one direction, it changes everything about how you see politics. When you are rooting for one outcome, your analysis of every situation is filtered through that preference. You are more likely to notice the flaws in the other side. You are less likely to notice the flaws in your own. You protect your team's narrative even when the evidence is going against it. Parker and Stone have mocked Republicans and Democrats with equal energy across the entire run of the show. They have mocked Trump. They have mocked Clinton. They have mocked Obama. They have mocked liberals and conservatives. They mocked cancel culture from the left and nativism from the right in the same season, in the same episode, deliberately because they believed both things were happening simultaneously and both deserved to be on screen. This equal opportunity approach means they are not motivated to soften any prediction because it might hurt a side they are rooting for. When they saw that Trump's immigration politics had real energy behind them and were going to have real consequences, they depicted it. They did not downplay it because they found Trump's politics distasteful. When they saw that cancel culture enforcement was going to have real consequences for how people spoke and thought and participated in public life, they depicted it. They did not downplay it because they agreed with some of the underlying concerns. The predictions are accurate partly because they are not shaped by the desire for any particular outcome. When you genuinely do not care who wins, you can see what is actually happening more clearly than almost anyone who does. There is also something specific about the format of South Park, animation, children, a small town, that enables the show to do things live-action political satire cannot. When you put a real political situation into the mouths of fourth graders in Colorado, something happens to it. The situation gets stripped of its usual packaging. The professional language goes away. The careful framing that politicians and commentators use to make things sound more reasonable or more extreme than they are gets replaced by a child just saying the thing directly. A kid in South Park does not have the vocabulary to dress up an idea in polished language. They just say what it is. This is why the PETA member's explanation in Douche and Turd hits as hard as it does. Nearly every election is between some douche and some turd. They're the only people who suck up enough to make it that far in politics. That observation, delivered by a political scientist in careful academic language, would take 3 paragraphs and land softly. Delivered by a man at a PETA commune to a 10-year-old on a horse, it takes 12 seconds and lands like a brick. The animation also means that South Park can visualize things that live action cannot. They can show member berries as actual talking fruit. They can show a giant douche and a turd sandwich running against each other in a debate. They can show PC principal beating a child for using the wrong word. The visual extremity of animation lets the show push ideas to their furthest point in a way that feels funny rather than preachy, which means the audience absorbs the idea before they have a chance to build a defense against it. Parker and Stone have also been willing to be publicly wrong and adjust. They expected Trump to lose and had to rewrite their season finale overnight. They said in interviews that the reality of 2016 had outpaced their ability to satirize it. They admitted the member berries got ahead of them in ways they had not fully planned. This willingness to acknowledge that they got something wrong, or did not see something coming, or had to scramble to catch up with reality, this honesty is part of what makes their accurate predictions credible. They are not claiming special insight. They are not presenting themselves as prophets. They are just two people who pay extremely close attention, follow ideas to their conclusions, have no interest in protecting anyone's feelings, and work fast enough that by the time they finish a thought about the current moment has not moved on yet. That combination, attention, honesty, speed, and no allegiance, produces something that looks like prediction, but is really just description. Very fast, very honest description of what is already present and where it is clearly heading. The predictions were not magic, they were the natural result of a specific way of seeing and a specific willingness to say what you see out loud without softening it in 6 days, every week for nearly 30 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and now that we have seen all 11 of those predictions laid out, from the wall in 2015 to the White House statement in 2025, from the school mascot election in 2004 to the trade war in 2025, from the talking berries to the ICE raids, there is only one thing left to do. Pull it all together. Look at what these 11 moments, taken as a whole, actually say about American politics and about the show that kept describing it before it arrived. Section 12. The show that wouldn't stop being right. There's a version of this essay that ends with a simple point. South Park predicted a lot of things. Here they are. Is that not impressive? But that version misses what is actually interesting about everything covered across the previous 11 sections, because the predictions themselves, as striking as they are not the real story. The real story is what they add up to when you lay them all side by side and look at the full picture. And what they add up to is this. For nearly 30 years, two men in Colorado have been watching American politics more clearly and more honestly than almost any other voice in the country, not because they are smarter than everyone else. Not because they have some special ability to see the future, but because they refuse to do the one thing that almost every other observer of American politics does instinctively and constantly. They refuse to protect the story. Every prediction in this essay came from the same place. Parker and Stone saw something happening, followed it to where it was obviously going, and put that destination on screen. They did not stop because the destination was uncomfortable. They did not stop because the destination might upset people they liked or embarrass people they agreed with. They did not stop because the destination was too dark or too absurd or too extreme to say out loud in a cartoon watched by millions. They just kept going until they got there. The Garrison/Trump prediction worked because they looked at what a campaign built entirely on anger and outrage and wall promises was going to produce and drew the full version of it in September 2015, while everyone on television was still calling it a joke. The Member Berries prediction worked because they looked at the emotional engine underneath the Make America Great Again slogan and described what that engine actually ran on. Nostalgia, comfort, and a version of the past that served some people better than others. The Gerald trolling prediction worked because they looked at what internet culture was already producing and asked what happened when that culture got pointed at a federal election. In every case, the thing they were describing was already present. Already visible, already in motion. They did not invent it, they just followed it further than anyone else was willing to go. Something else connects all 11 of these predictions that is worth saying plainly. None of them were partisan. The wall prediction mocked Trump's campaign, but it also mocked the way his voters responded to a joke candidate the way Canada's voters had, and by letting the joke go too far. The PC principle prediction mocked progressive enforcement culture with the same energy that the Garrison prediction mocked right-wing nativism. Douche and Turd said both parties produce bad candidates. The Member Berries described the psychology of MAGA without endorsing the alternative. The Gerald storyline depicted trolling as a widespread human behavior without telling you which side was doing more of it. Sponsored content mocked the breakdown of real journalism without picking a team. Every single prediction in this essay cut in more than one direction. Parker and Stone were never describing one side's failures. They were describing the system, the whole machine. The way both ends of the political spectrum fed each other's worst tendencies, the way both sides used the same tools for different goals, the way the conflict itself, regardless of who was winning at any given moment, kept producing the same results for ordinary people trying to live their lives in the middle of it. That refusal to pick a lane is the thing that made the predictions accurate, and it is the thing that made the show genuinely dangerous to everyone in power. Not just the people on one side, but anyone whose position depended on people not looking too closely at how the whole thing actually works. Look at what the timeline of these predictions actually shows. In 2004, the show said elections are always between two bad options, and the system produces this by design. In 1999, the show said America has a deep habit of blaming external countries for internal problems, and that Canada specifically could be a target of this. In 2015, the show said a campaign built on immigration fear and wall promises could produce a real winner, that political correctness would become a defining enforcement culture, and that the news was becoming indistinguishable from advertising. In 2016, the show said nostalgia was being weaponized as a political tool and that internet trolling was connected to the rise of political disruption. In 2017, the show said a president who governs primarily through social media posts would make dangerous situations worse in real time. In 2025, the show said a trade war with Canada was coming, and that immigration enforcement would become a dominant feature of daily American life. That is not a list of random lucky guesses. That is a consistent, coherent portrait of a political system and a culture moving in a specific direction. Each prediction connects to the others. The nostalgia feeds the wall campaign. The wall campaign feeds the troll culture. The troll culture feeds the collapse of real news. The collapse of real news feeds the ability of a candidate nobody takes seriously to become someone everybody has to take seriously. And then the White House responds to a cartoon. Parker and Stone were not making separate predictions. They were describing one long, continuous thing, the shape of a country changing in a specific way over a specific period of time, and each episode was another frame in that picture. There is something specific about the White House statement from July 2025 that serves as the most fitting endpoint for this whole story. The statement called South Park irrelevant. It said the show was hanging on by a thread. It said the creators had no original ideas and were desperate for attention. And it said all of this in an official statement released to a major entertainment publication from the press office of the President of the United States the morning after a South Park episode aired. Think about what that statement required. Someone in the White House watched the episode or was briefed on it. Someone made the decision that it required an official response. Someone wrote the statement. Someone approved the statement. Someone sent the statement to the Hollywood Reporter. All of that institutional machinery and was set in motion by a cartoon. The show that the statement called irrelevant was, at that exact moment, more relevant than it had been in 25 years. The ratings confirmed it. The social media response confirmed it. The fact that the government felt the need to respond confirmed it most clearly of all. You do not issue official statements about things that do not matter. You ignore things that do not matter. The statement was the proof of relevance it claimed to be denying, and this is in its own way the final prediction coming true. Not a specific political event, not a specific tweet or a specific policy, but the broader thing that all 11 sections of this essay have been building toward. The idea that a cartoon about children in a small mountain town would eventually become important enough to the real machinery of American power that the real machinery of American power would feel the need to officially respond to it. South Park spent nearly 30 years describing where American politics was going, and in July 2025, American politics looked directly at South Park and blinked first. The show is still running. Season 27 concluded in September 2025, and Season 28 began airing the following month, continuing the storylines Parker and Stone had built across the summer. The 5-year deal with Paramount means there will be more South Park through at least 2030. More episodes written in 6 days, more ideas followed to their uncomfortable endpoints, more predictions that will not look like predictions until the world catches up. Whatever South Park is pointing at right now, and whatever is in the current episodes, whatever Parker and Stone are watching and following and drawing in their animation software this week, some portion of it will probably look familiar in a few years. Not because they have a crystal ball, but because they are doing what they have always done, watching, writing, following the logic, refusing to stop before the uncomfortable part. The wall came true, the tweets came true. The nostalgia politics came true. The cancel culture came true. The Canada War came true. The government started using their imagery to promote real operations. The White House officially responded. And somewhere in the current season of a cartoon about 4 kids in Colorado, there is probably already a picture of something that has not happened yet. It will. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.